frames are synths.
Recently, one of the hottest topics in the world of electronic music, or at least this kind of weird gear-adjacent electronic music world that we tend to inhabit, has been, of course, that Teenage Engineering have announced that they have finally decided to update the classic OP-1 with the OP-1 field. Now, I believe they announced this a few weeks ago at Superbooth. I don't really know, because instead of attending Superbooth like all the other YouTube people, I decided to go on tour with my band, and so I was probably asleep somewhere, passed out drunk in a van rather than watching Superbooth. However, it has caused a bit of a stushy online, particularly on YouTube, where people have been sharing their thoughts and feelings about the new OP-1 field and how it's personally hurt them that Teenage Engineering have decided to charge so much money. And this kind of thing is not something that I would usually really want to make any videos on. I would much rather just share and demo some of the gear that I have and that I use to make music, because really that's the whole point, and the main thrust of this channel is to share what I do with the gear to make music, not actually, you know, synthesizer gossip or some shit like that. However, I've decided to make a rare exception in this case, because people have asked me what I think about it. Simon the Magpie, of all people, recently, I was on his live stream in some kind of weird last minute situation, and he was talking about it. And also, to be fair, I have talked a lot about the cost of the original OP-1 in some recent videos. So I thought I would talk about the OP-1 field a wee bit in this, share some of my thoughts, and then I'll probably never speak of it again. So, you know, either watch this or don't. If you want to watch things about music, I've got plenty of other videos about that, so go check them out, because nobody watches them. Nobody watches them. Anyway, the first thing I should say about all of this is that I'm really glad to see that Teenage Engineering haven't actually just abandoned the OP-1, and they are bringing in updates, or at least an upgraded version, because it wasn't all that long ago that people were saying, well, Teenage Engineering have moved on, they're a design company now, they'll never update the OP-1, you know, they'll never do OP-2 or whatever people were calling it. And so Teenage Engineering have proved them wrong. They clearly have been working on some new cool things. They clearly are still a kind of music gear, electronic music synthesizer style-ish company, whatever you want to make of it. And so it's nice to see that they've brought out something new. The original OP-1 was getting long in the tooth. The technology that it's based on was fairly old. There were a bunch of limitations and things that they could have upgraded, and it would have been cool to see Teenage Engineering take advantage of all of that. Whether or not they've actually done that or achieved that is another question. However, it's nice to see that they are actually still making gear and making things, because ultimately that's what I'm interested in, people making things. A few specific things about the OP-1 field that I really like are the ability to use different tapes or switch them out, which essentially means that you can have multiple projects on the OP-1 field at any one time, as far as I understand it anyway, because again, I've not actually used one of these things. But in theory, this means that it would address one of the main issues I had with the OP-1, which was that you can't really take it away when you travel and write a whole album or something like that without having to work around the fact that you've got a 6-minute tape limitation in there. So having the ability to switch out different tapes and save different projects is actually massive, and it's something that makes the OP-1 far more usable, I think, from my perspective, as a kind of musical creation tool and not just a sketchpad, even though I hate that phrase. The second thing that's really cool, I think, is that they have listened to some of the feedback from people over the years, and so for example, they have created a new reverb algorithm, or at least they've created a new reverb effect in the OP-1 field, and that is partly because if you've ever used an OP-1, you'll know that whilst the spring reverb that's in there might be true to analog or whatever that means, but it just didn't sound particularly great. A spring reverb is a very particular effect, and it doesn't necessarily work all the time, or you know, it doesn't give the effect that you might want all the time. So it's good to see they listened and added in a new effect and new synth engine and all that kind of thing. Now, to come on to the elephant in the room, or maybe not the elephant in the room since everybody's been fucking talking about this particular elephant, I am of course referring to the cost of the OP-1 field, because it comes in at a whopping £1,999 in the United Kingdom. I believe believe it's 1,999 US dollars, perhaps, as well, which is always strange because the currency conversion means that we end up paying way more in the UK than in the US. But anyway, the point is, it is not an inexpensive device by any stretch of the imagination. And when we start to think about that, I think you have to consider various perspectives or various different people who might be looking at the OP-1. If you have never been interested in the original OP-1 and weren't, beguiled by its alternative composition workflow or anything like that, then you're not going to be won over by the new OP-1 Field, and you're definitely not going to think that £2,000 is worth it for the updated version. It just isn't for you. That is not the device that you should be spending money on. This is not the device that will win you round to teenage engineering's kind of cause or anything like that. So that's fairly straightforward. If you thought the original OP-1 was too expensive, then you'll definitely think that the OP-1 Field was too expensive. On to the second category. If you've never had an OP-1 before, but you have been interested in the workflow and you've been considering getting one, but you know it's a kind of premium product and you're going to have to save up money and all that kind of thing, but you're kind of on the edge of whether to do it or not, then perhaps the OP-1 Field might actually win you over and convince you to buy one, because obviously, even though it's more expensive, perhaps you'd be more inclined to buy something at £2,000 than £1,300 because it's brand new and it's updated and it's got all these other added features that weren't there before, and it's 2022 and you might get better customer support, maybe. Unlikely, perhaps, but this might win you over if you were curious about the OP-1 but never tried it. And so that is a category of people that might be interested in buying one. Similarly, if you already have an OP-1 and you love it, I know people that use the OP-1 kind of extensively in their live acts and stuff like that, then perhaps you would be interested in upgrading to the new OP-1 Field because it will help expand what you actually do with it. And in that case, it's perfectly justifiable. Even if it's not an inexpensive device, you might be prepared to pay the cost in order to get one. And on that note, I think that it can seem weird at first, or kind of counterintuitive, or perhaps even galling, that Teenage Engineering have decided not to immediately lower the price of the original OP-1. But on one hand, this also means, or at least on the other hand, it also means that if you have an OP-1 and you want to sell it to partly fund the new OP-1 Field, then you're not going to be stung by Teenage Engineering effectively dropping the resale price of your original OP-1. So that's something to consider as well. Now, for the final category of people, you might be like me, somebody that bought an OP-1 about a year or so ago, and whilst you might like it, you don't necessarily love it. The workflow might be interesting and everything, but it's not necessarily something that has completely changed the way you make music or whatever. And so at that point, you need to decide whether or not the features that they've added to the OP-1 Field are enough to make you consider selling your current OP-1 or buying a second OP-1 Field, and whether or not the cost variance there is actually worth it for the features that you're getting. And in my case, I have to say that the addition of £700 onto the original cost is definitely not worth it for me based on the OP-1 itself, in the sense that whilst I enjoy using the OP-1, I don't think that the features that they've added are worth an extra £700 to me. They just aren't. And so for that reason, I have no real interest or inclination to get an OP-1 Field. And this is partly why I haven't really talked about it or anything, because ultimately it's just, I'm not interested in it. And so I don't think too much about gear that is way out of my price league for the features that it offers, if that makes sense. Now, one thing that I do find quite strange about all of this is the idea that Teenage Engineering are somehow going after an entirely different target market purely because they've priced the OP-1 Field where they have. It may well be, and probably actually is the case, that they would like to establish themselves or entrench themselves further as a luxury brand, kind of like the Leica of the boutique synthesizer or music production world. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are targeting a different market. And I refer to this specifically because I've seen a number of videos and conversations where people have said things like, well, do you know what? I'm not prepared to pay this price because it's too much money, but I just have to accept that I'm no longer the target market for teenage engineering or this product. And this seems weird to me because it seems to fundamentally misunderstand what a target market is. Just because a price is higher, it doesn't mean that the company is now going after a different target market. It can simply mean that they are trying to test the market to see what the market can bear or will accept in terms of price. It could well be that teenage engineering have actually kind of just fundamentally misunderstood or misjudged what the target market, i.e. us, is prepared to pay for the product, especially given that they were already on that premium edge. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Teenage engineering don't seem like a company that will drastically change their pricing structure anytime soon, but I'm not convinced that that doesn't mean that they haven't made a bit of an error here. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the OP-1 field controversy. As I mentioned, I will not be rushing out anytime soon to buy one for myself, and I also for some reason think that it's fairly unlikely that Teenage Engineering will be sending me one for free, despite my clearly meteoric rise to YouTube fame and success. So don't expect any more content on the OP-1 field on this channel, or any content on the wee mixer that they're trying to sell for $1,200 or whatever it is. Instead, I'll be sticking to the OG OP-1 and a whole host of other weird and wonderful devices that you can make music with for much cheaper. If you do have any thoughts to share on what I've said, or you want to disagree or anything like that, please feel free to do so below. Every comment you leave helps feed the algorithmic overlords that all of us YouTube uploaders have to depend on, the kind of teat that we have to milk for the scraps of ad revenue and all that kind of thing. But the one thing that I will caution you against is that if you're interested in this topic to the extent that you're passionate about it, in the sense that you're aggressively kind of expressive with your dissatisfaction, then you perhaps should reconsider when you go to leave your visceral comments on a channel, for example, of somebody who just bought an OP-1 field because they liked it, or perhaps somebody who beta tested a unit, or even the designers of the OP-1 field themselves, because no matter how displeased or unhappy you might be with the fact that you can't afford or don't want to pay the price of an OP-1 field, it doesn't give you a license to be a So if that is you, you need to have a fucking word with yourself, and I'm not interested in it. For now, that's all I have to say. I'm never going to talk about the fucking OP-1 field again. Goodbye.